What's going on, everyone? It's another episode of the WVSports.com podcast, and the smoke has started to rise from the West Virginia Coliseum because the Mountaineers have a new basketball coach, Keenan. So Ross Hodge, he has officially been named the next head men's basketball coach at West Virginia, coming over from North Texas, where he's been the head coach there for the last couple of seasons. Prior to being the head coach there, he was an assistant under a guy that many Big 12 fans will know, Grant McCasland, the current head coach of Texas Tech. So, Keno, I know Vernon was kind of on top of this from the beginning. You had him in your original hot board. Hat tip to you. Hat tip to Vernon, who on our message board Monday night kind of indicated this is where this thing was likely going to end up. And then here we are Wednesday afternoon, and it is officially official from WVU, who just put out word that Hodge is coming to Morgantown. And so let's dive into it. Let's start off with the kind of elephant in the room of we are 9 days into this search and we finally have a conclusion. It seems evident, probably, that this was not the first choice. And with him not being the first choice, there are a lot of question marks as you get further and further down the list of candidates. And some of those question marks are pretty clear. But what are your biggest kind of maybe concerns, but then also your biggest, the things that you understand the most about this hire?
Well, you mentioned the hot board, and the reason that he was on there was those ties. I think in a perfect world, uh, Grant McCasland's probably coaching West Virginia right now. You can't get him, obviously. He's at Texas Tech. This is kind of the next best thing. Doing some research on him throughout this process, I didn't know a lot. I knew there were connections there. I knew, obviously, he took over from McCasland there at North Texas. It's kind of interesting to me. He was the quote unquote defensive coordinator there. McCasland kind of sent him over for and to learn under Adams, who was at Texas Tech at the time. They really wanted to have a more aggressive, kind of dictating style of defense, and he learned the scheme. They were able to teach him and has applied it, and it's kind of his baby, and it's become kind of the calling card of what North Texas has been known for, really, under McCasland, and now, continued under Hodge. So, I think the things that we'll get out of the way first is from basketball circle standpoint, I haven't heard anything negative about the guy. I think he's very well respected as a tactician, as a coach. Obviously you're doing less, you're trying to do more with less when you're at North Texas than some of these major schools. And from a roster standpoint, I know that's people kind of almost want to bypass the coach and get straight into the roster. And we'll talk about that here in a bit. But the thing that impressed me is, when he was elevated to head coach from associate head coach, they lost the bulk of their roster that first offseason. He had to rebuild it with players that he pulled out of the portal, junior college players. And they only went 19-15, but they dealt with a lot of injuries throughout the year. And then he had it happen to him again. He lost his top 6 scorers heading into this season. Had to rebuild things again through the transfer portal and some picking at different levels. And the end result, obviously they're 27-8 this year. I think that's what you want to see. He's not just a 2-year coach. He's been an assistant at various stops, obviously worked under McCasland. We talked about that for 6 years, which is where he kind of interacted with Ren Baker, who was the AD there in Denton from 2016 to 2022. But he's also been a really successful junior college coach. The guy's junior college record is amazing. And you look at that, kind of circling back to the roster standpoint, you got to rebuild rosters almost every year at the junior college level. So he's kind of equipped to handle, that NIL piece, that roster management piece that Ren has made so important, throughout all of his searches, that defense check. So young coach, well respected, has had a lot of success, and now he's going to get a bigger opportunity. Obviously, there's risk attached. This is a guy that's coached 2 years at Division I, being a head coach, that is. 2 years. It's not a long time. He hasn't gone to the NCAA tournament either of those years. Not necessarily sure that's his fault, other than trying to win the conference tournament. But there's some good teams in that league. Memphis is in that league. UAB, there's some good teams in that league. So I do think there's some risk, but I was talking to you before we started this. There's risk, but that Ren Baker understands that that's his risk to take. Ultimately, this is his call. He has to make a decision on what he thinks is in the best interest of the program. And you look, at the release that was released today on the hire, highlighting some of his achievements, and then all the quotes from people that are around basketball. I think that was intentional. And you put those quotes in there because this is a name that, unless you're, on our website or following West Virginia coaching searches religiously, you probably don't know a lot about Ross Hodge right now. You don't. You're trying to figure it out. So, what better way to kind of drive home that this is a guy that, while he might not have the experience coaching at a high level, he does have, kind of a lot of respect in basketball circles. So I think that matters, and I think that's going to play well. I'm interested to see kind of how things are handled, moving forward. Obviously, the announcement's out of the way, but he still has a season to finish. I know anybody that is involved in the coaching search was watching that game last night, kind of rooting for things to go the other way to kind of get this thing off the ground. But my understanding is he's going to continue to coach, his team, just kind of like Grant McCaslin did when he was there before he went to Texas Tech. Now, yes, I wrote about this earlier. If you checked it out on our website, WVSports.com, is that a concern? Is that ideal? No, it's not ideal. But Grant McCaslin did it at Texas Tech. He wasn't hired until the 31st of March and led them to the NCAA tournament the next year. So it's possible. Darren DeVries, I know that's a dirty word right now, but proved that you can turn around things rather quickly in today's environment. This isn't college basketball 10 years ago. And this isn't what John Beilein inherited, when he got into this program. You have resources to work with. It's never been easier to get players in terms of players that can come in and make an impact. And then you have his experience at the junior college level. He's obviously mined that before and understands that. So there's pros, there's cons, but honestly, Wes, if you go up and down that list, even our initial list, you almost get the feeling that this is a hire. Now, I don't know this for a fact, but it seems like this is a name that Baker's had higher on his list than probably any of us did when the list was first released, at least our guesstimation of a list. Ren Baker's obviously not sharing with me daily on his contacts and what he's thinking. But I think this is clearly a guy that Ren Baker valued. He knows him. He knows kind of the cut of his cloth. And it's a guy that if you're going to be, it's almost better to be early than late in these things. Because think about last year when West Virginia hired DeVries. Ben McCollum's name was on my list. Nico Medved's name was on my list. Were they as desirable? No. Would another year at North Texas make him much more desirable if he goes and does the same thing or even leads a team to a tournament? Absolutely. So, yes, the experience is something that you question. But overall, I feel like if you're going to be early, it's maybe a year ahead of where you'd expect it to go. But it seems like West Virginia's got a really well-rounded coach, and now you want to see what he can do. What are you going to do with building a roster? You got a lot of challenges putting a staff together, and all this stuff's going to move quickly. But, I am more excited about the hire now than I was initially. And I think more of that is due to kind of what I mentioned earlier, learning more and understanding more kind of about his background and, what he's about.
Yeah, I think the point about Ren is a really good one. Shout out to Cody Nesper, our friend there. He tweeted this about how a couple years ago when White bolted on the women's side, Ren kind of went and hired Mark Kellogg, a guy he was familiar with. And then here we are 2 years later on the men's side of hoops, and DeVries bolts, and here comes another guy that Ren is familiar with. And I think that familiarity is key. And I know we've obviously seen the success that this women's team has had in their first couple years under Kellogg. I mean, going to the NCAA tournament twice, winning a game each year. You obviously hope that you can duplicate that, and it's probably easier said than done. But those relationships are an important piece of this just because you're understanding what you're getting. And I think especially with all the angst now surrounding will you get a coach and then he'll just go and use West Virginia kind of as that stepping stone. I feel like that word gets thrown around a bunch, especially on our message board. like if you have that relationship and that trust factor with a coach, you can certainly understand that the likelihood of them leaving is a lot less in terms of percentages. And then in terms of just how what he brings to the floor, the roster construction is a very crucial part of this because it's a year to year thing. You're not really in an ideal world, in every coach's ideal world, yeah, you're bringing in freshmen and you're developing them for 2 to 3 years. But that's just not the way it is anymore. I mean, we've already seen a bunch of guys enter the portal from WVU. While that was expected because they lost a coach, that probably could have happened anyway, just the way college athletics goes. And so understanding how to build a roster, understanding how to evaluate talent, that's not a thing that every coach is great at. But when you're as successful as he was, I think he won 85% of his games at the JUCO level, like that is hard to do. And then add in that he now gets Division 1 Power 4 resources from a school like WVU, and he's not at a school like North Texas that respectfully to North Texas, they just don't have as many resources as a school like West Virginia does. And then you can start of kind of create this concoction of talent identifier plus money plus NIL plus rev share equals better roster. Better roster equals better chances to win, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that's also an important part. And then just winning games. I think the biggest thing when some names were getting thrown around our message board, people were wondering, well, they haven't won. I mean, they've got I think what 8 losses this year. I don't care where you are in America. If you're losing 8 games, it means you're a pretty good squad. I know they're in the NIT, but they're in what I think the American was a 2-bid league this year to the NCAA tournament. So that's a tough league. You kind of have to either be the best team in the regular season or win the conference tournament, and those are hard things to do. And so I think yes, West Virginia probably didn't get their top pick, but I agree with you that Hodge was very likely a lot higher for West Virginia people internally than it was externally for people on the outside.
Yeah, and the roster building thing, like you mentioned, I just think it's critical for people to realize that he's done this. It's kind of like what Rich had talked about when he was hired. Being at a group of 5 school, it's a lot harder. You're going to lose your best players. It's just kind of the nature of the beast. It's really hard to retain really anybody. And you saw that last year. They like I said, they had some injuries. They had kind of a difficult first season, which, I know it's a same coaching staff type of deal. It's not a major change, but it's still a change. But I'm more impressed with what they were able to do this year. Not just record, but losing your top 6 scorers, 5 of them to transfer, and then going out and identifying more talent in really short order to be able to put together what they've done this year. And obviously, calling card is going to be defense. And I think one of the questions I have moving forward is what does the offense look like? They play at a slower, deliberate pace at North Texas, but that's kind of what they do. That's what they've done. So does it change? Grant McCaslin's a good example of that. They're more up tempo. Their offense looks a lot more exciting because he has the athletes and the ability to do that. Will he be able to do that now at West Virginia? I think the answer is yes. We'll see how it all comes together, but there's a lot of things that go into this. And when you look at, you make a chart and kind of list all the pros and cons. I definitely think right now, as of today, the day that Ross Hodge is hired, I think there's certainly more pros than cons. I'm not sure there's a ton of cons outside experience, and that's a big one. I mean, there's no way you can slice that. I mean, that's a big one. You don't see a lot of coaches in college basketball necessarily make the jump from 2 years at a Division I program to leading a Power 4 program, but it's happened. I mean, look at Ben McCollum. He was there 1 year. So
Yeah.
I think that it's funny to me in ways, I kind of kid, but, Ben McCollum seemed almost like an afterthought to people on our message board last year. There were people that really respected him on the basketball side of things, but generally it was, he's got to go prove himself. And now 1 year later, he was, the greatest thing that's
The
ever
hottest
happened.
commodity in the
And
coaching
I am not
search.
taking, I think he's an excellent coach. In no way am I saying anything negative, but I think perception sometimes isn't reality. And I think West Virginia got themselves a good tactician that kind of knows what he's doing and really has a chance to elevate the program. You want to keep the one thing you got to avoid here for West Virginia is these restarts. It's hard to build
Yeah.
momentum when you're restarting everything. And I'm really interested to see. We know it's a 5-year contract. I've foiled it already. Haven't got that back yet, but I'll be interested to see the terms. I would expect it kind of be similar to what DeVries got, maybe a little lower. I think it was 2.8 in the first year, and also the buyout. How friendly is it to West Virginia on both sides? We'll find out in terms of somebody trying to come in. And let's be honest, they got quite the chunk of change for DeVries. A lot of people have been asking me about why isn't that more? And Ren Baker addressed this too. $6 million is a
A
ton
ton of
for
money. Yeah.
that's football money typically. So I'll be interested to see if that's even more favorable just based off what happened, and you can't compare situations. I know a lot of people have been, I don't want to say frustrated, upset, and some of that's gone back to Ren Baker on hiring Darren DeVries, and I just don't think that's fair. You can't predict what someone else is going to do. You hire a guy to try to win and win now, and if I know it's going to make some people mad, but Indiana's still one of the top 10 basketball jobs out there. Maybe not results, but jobs. If they come sniffing, I think you did something right in your hiring process. Now, unfortunately, they couldn't keep him, but if you're having that same thing happen a year ago, you have to deal with it then. I mean, a year from now, you have to deal with it then. But in the meantime, I think that you look at what West Virginia did with this. Yeah, I think you're right. Did any of us go in saying, "Yep, Ross Hodge is the guy. You got to target him"? And I think that was the thing compared to last year's search, where perception that once again kind of took on a life of its own. It was Darren DeVries at the starting, and really all the way through to the ending. This one, we were kind of guessing a little bit at the start, and there were obviously candidates that some people like more than others. Jared Calhoun's a name that we discussed on this opening thing. You had people that were fully in support. You had people that were completely against it. So I don't think there was a perfect candidate this time. There was risk every way. And, as I mentioned earlier, it's Baker's risk to take, and he made this decision.
There was also a lot more dominoes that fell in the last week in terms of other coaching searches, in terms of Texas moving on from Rodney Terry and then Sean Miller obviously leaving Xavier to go there. And then the two Midwest jobs of Minnesota and Iowa getting filled. And so there was a lot that happened that makes it harder and harder for a guy like Ren Baker to do his job and hire a coach because there's so many moving parts to it all. Of you might have identified a candidate, but then another school's also identified that candidate, or you might have identified a candidate, but then there's a new opening and that school then identifies that candidate. And so the Villanova job obviously was still open. There's just a lot going on. Keep in mind that a lot of these candidates were also in the NCAA tournament or postseason tournament, just like Hodges. But I think the biggest thing, Keno, for me is that while it might not be the sexiest name on paper, what will have to then I think be proven is that he can win at this level, because when you need the buy-in and the financial support of donors, specifically for name, image, and likeness money, you're going to have to show that you can win here. And while you can't do that until November, that's going to be the biggest thing for this offseason, is seeing the financial support with a new and pretty unproven coach. But you go back to like even the JUCO numbers, like he won 85% of his games at the JUCO level. Like that is elite stuff. It's just hard to do that in a sport like basketball when so many things can change, so many things can dictate the swing of a game. One thing for me when we kind of get into the roster thing is how quickly it happens, because he's still coaching. The portal's wide open, as we know. The Mountaineers have obviously already lost a bunch of guys. Not surprising, as we mentioned earlier. But how do you manage that? Because the portal means a lot more to a school right now like WVU than it probably does to North Texas at this point in time, just because North Texas probably was never going to compete for some of those top tier guys, or a school like West Virginia can probably afford to compete for some of those top tier guys. So that's what I would say is the biggest looming thing, is the roster construction part of this and the timeline that takes.
Yeah, and do you retain, anybody? Is
Mm-hmm.
Chester Frazier, who's under contract for another year currently. He's the only one of the assistants that is after April 30th is still under contract. Is that a possibility? Obviously, if it is, there's probably players that come along with that. Is that a decision you make? You don't ever want to force an assistant on a coach. It just typically doesn't work. But, it's a question that'll need to be answered. What happens in the meantime? Is there a GM hired? Is there a guy running this, while what's going on? I think that I've heard all indications are the press conference obviously is going to be delayed a little bit because they're still in the NIT, but I think it'll be interesting to hear what Ren Baker, and Ross have to say about this, how they're going to handle it, how they're going to attack it. And I do think it's important to make this clear, guys. Just because the portal is open, all that means is when players can enter their name, you can recruit them all the way up to when you enroll. So as long as you're in there, that's all that matters. I think sometimes people panic when, it's the first week and the portal's rolling. Most of the guys that are making decisions already, they already knew where they were going. There's this thing out there, guys, you might have heard of it, called tampering. It's a dirty word, almost like DeVries.
It's called I got a cell phone, you got a cell phone. Let's call someone up, DM somebody, get a high school or AAU coach on the line, things like that.
Yeah, some of these guys will go in there and commit like 3 hours later. I mean, do you really think that happened that quickly? I mean, it is speed dating to a degree, but it ain't that fast. So I do think that there's going to be a lot of players out there, and you got to get style too. They want obviously long, lengthy athletic guys to run the defense they run. Not every guy's going to be a fit that might have been a fit under a previous coach. So that'll be interesting. Right now, West Virginia, not, counting all the players that have exited either graduation or transfer, have 3 scholarship players. 2 of those did not play a minute last year. The other one played like 50. So a lot of work to do with the roster. It's going to be, unless, perhaps Frazier stays on and you retain a few guys, it's going to be almost a complete rebuild for really almost the 3rd year in a row.
Yeah. And also, it's not, and it's not surprising, but I also think that even if DeVries was here, it was going to probably be somewhat of a rebuild too, because they were losing so many guys that contributed so much. Like they were losing.
I think Kyle was out regardless.
I think so too. Also, on the front of just timeline stuff, April 1st is the NIT semifinals where North Texas is, because they won a Big 12 road game. Ross Hodge has already won a Big 12 road game against Oklahoma State last night.
How ironic was that Ed Wright was on that team, and that was a guy that DeVries recruited and for whatever reason didn't work out, and his efforts are probably the reason North Texas won that game to delay this thing even further. So yeah, the hits keep on coming there.
Yeah, but that is it, because that's a long time. It's 5 days. You would hope that you get some answers on either maybe staff or players or just anything, because that's what you're hopeful for. Especially because I get he's 2 years into this, but doing this at a West Virginia is a lot different than doing this at a North Texas.
Yeah, that's the risk. That's what we talked
about.
And
that's the risk too, is like, yes, you can have an idea of how you're going to build a roster, but the way it's done here is, I guess, a heck of a lot different than the way it's done there. And how do you manage that? Who do you possibly bring in, right, to understand that? I mean, even think back 2 years ago to when Josh was the interim. They brought a couple veteran guys onto that staff who had coached elsewhere and previously in college to kind of help Josh along in that process. Now, do you bring someone in who's more experienced in the portal, more experienced in NIL? Maybe we shall see. I imagine Ren, being the guy who he is and covering all his bases, probably had a couple of questions like that in some of these interviews or discussions. You just kind of are assuming that Ren understands the risk, and part of understanding the risk is asking Hodge how he will kind of face that risk and answer the bell.
Yeah. I mean, it's a situation where, Ren took a risk. I mean, obviously we've talked about it, but it could be a risk that really pays off. I mean, the guy seems primed. You look at what he's been able to do in the AAC, and it looks good. Obviously he's well respected. I think that I hope that people are willing to give him a chance, because I know some people, when they don't get the coach they want, they get upset or vice versa. And I think by the time November rolls around, everybody's going to be on board. But hiring that GM is going to be an important role, Wes. Who are you going to put in that? Who's going to handle that? Obviously, ties, connections. Who is anybody? Are they going to bring anybody from North Texas? Are those some roster spots that you can fill pretty easily? There's a few guys on that roster that look appealing. So obviously they played against Oklahoma State last night. Now, granted, Oklahoma State was at the bottom of the league, but still, it's a Big 12 game. You mentioned it, Big 12 road game. So a lot of questions still. And this thing, people always ask me about coaching searches. Yeah, they're tiring, but then you get to this part. This is where the real fun begins. The roster, the coaching staff, all this stuff, all these different pieces moving in and out, the transfer portal, guys leaving, guys coming in. So there's a whole lot left to unfold, with what the story is going to be and what this team is going to look like. Expectations, it's a popular topic. I don't have any expectations right now. But I do. I'm not going to make an exception to the rule that I firmly believe in college sports right now is, as I mentioned earlier, it's easier to turn things around than it's ever been. So I don't think you shoot for bottom of the barrel. You're not going to be okay with a losing season. Are you going to be 19-13 like DeVries just pulled off? I don't know. Maybe better. I guess we'll see. But you don't necessarily look at this as, you got to give this guy 3 years to turn it around like you used to. It's got to happen rather quickly.
Yeah, I think like even the 1 year grace periods for some are starting to kind of be thrown out the window of you've kind of got to get this going sooner rather than later, just because you look around college sports and college basketball specifically, when you've got a 68 team tournament and you've got what 30 some at large bids, like there's paths to this thing in March. And I mean, truthfully, West Virginia probably should have had a first year coach in March this year. And maybe that changes everything the past week or so. Who knows? But that's revisionist history at this point. But yeah, I think two final thoughts for me. This team was third in the country in scoring defense, like third. Houston was one. So you know what you're getting there. And then just looking like at the West Virginia release, if you want to know what matters to Ren Baker, um, we are 5 words in, and it's not saying director of athletics Ren Baker announces. It is Ross Hodge, who has won 80% of his games as a head coach. That is the 5th word, is who has won 80% of his games as head coach. Winning matters to Ren Baker. I think he said that before. He wants a guy who's shown he can win, and Ross Hodge does check that box. And so you've got a guy who, what did Ren say last year before DeVries? He wanted find a guy who's a winner, find a guy who cared about defense. Ross Hodge checks both of those boxes in a big way. And so we'll see if everything else can continue to evolve, if he can continue to evolve as a head coach and adapt to what is still a changing landscape of college sports, especially as rev share starts to get going as well.
Yeah, I go back to kind of what I was mentioning earlier. I mean, he's been moving under these, plates for a while. He's been balancing roster movement before it was a thing. So you're doing it at the junior college level. Trust me, I've covered plenty of junior college recruiting over the years. You have entirely new rosters sometimes. I mean, really from year to year. So that's nothing new to him. Ren wanted to get a guy, and I think this is important to say too. We've mentioned the familiarity, but while some of us are kind of catching up, trying to get up to speed, Ren already knew all this stuff about the guy. Yeah, he obviously worked with him, for 6 years. Has an understanding, he's obviously followed them, over the last couple of years. So he keeps that list, he keeps talking about that every time, even when he doesn't need a coach. And I think this is definitely one of those lists that he had on there, or one of these names that he had on that list. And I don't think it's surprising. The connections don't always play out in coaching searches, but I'd be surprised if it didn't play a role in this one.
I fully agree. Anything else from you, or are we getting out of here?
I think we're done.
All right. Well, that'll do it for this episode of the WestVirginiaSports.com podcast. Hat tip to you, Keenan, once again on your original hot board. I think that's what I guess. I mean, you can name Rich, you can name DeVries, and now you can name Hodge. You're 3 for 3 in your last 3 hot boards, at least the 3 hot boards I've been around for,
Yeah.
in terms of being on it. Vernon was great per usual. Everyone on our
Yeah,
site, on our message
excellent
board,
insight.
can you guys relax now? It was a hectic, I would say, 8 or 9 days for everyone involved. A lot of
Now
questions,
we
a
just
lot of
need to
back
get
and forth.
along.
Yeah, it's good to give people a hug through the internet sometimes. But that'll do it for this episode of the WestVirginiaSports.com podcast. We will have all of this information and more on our website. You can go talk about it on the Blue Lot, talk about it with Vernon, give Vernon an air hug or whatever you want to do. But I'm Wesley Shoemaker, joined by Keenan Cummings. If you made it this far, we do appreciate you.